Welcome to our lesson on the Greek period. And for those of you who are Filipino, I'd like to ask you a question. Where does the Philippines get its name? You got your answer? Well, I know many of you are thinking King Philip of Spain. Okay, but where did King Philip of Spain get his name? Well, he got it from King Philip of Macedon, the Greek, who lived many, many years ago. And King Philip of Macedon, Macedonia was that area just to the north of Greece, and his goal in life was to unify the Greek states. And it's through the influence of the Greeks that we have our New Testament in the Greek language. And the Greeks have brought us many other things. Their wonderful architecture, their beautiful buildings, some of which these styles are used even to this day. The columns in the IGSL library are a form of Greek columns. Well, Philip of Macedon wanted to spread this Greek way of life around, and he wanted to unify the Greek states. But unfortunately, he was murdered, and so the mantle fell to his son, Alexander the Great, who was only 20 years old at the time. And Alexander, one of the first things he did was to avenge his father's death by conquering the Persian Empire. And so he planned many campaigns against the Persians. Well, growing up, Alexander the Great was schooled and taught by his tutor, Aristotle. So Alexander the Great had a very thorough education and philosophical background. And Alexander believed so strongly in the Greek way of life and the superiority of the Greek culture that he felt that everybody should be Greek. We call this process to make others Greek Hellenization. So he wanted to make the other peoples Greek and live just like he did. So as he went around conquering, he spread the Greek way of life. Well, the Greeks are known for their military and their brave soldiers. They had some very advanced tactics, military tactics in land warfare as the armies would march out and meet each other. Unfortunately, the front line of soldiers were the most vulnerable. They were the first ones to get mowed down. But the Greeks came up with a way to prevent that through the phalanx. So they could have their long spears out in front of them to keep the enemy at bay. And if anyone on the front line should falter, then the next line could drop their spears and take their place. And so this war tactic proved very effective, among many other strategies that the Greeks had. And so they were very successful in warfare against the Persians. Athens was the capital of the Greek Empire, and on top of the Acropolis stood the majestic building of the Parthenon, an impressive building indeed. The Greeks loved art, they loved culture, they loved plays and musicals, and so wherever they went, they built theaters where music could be performed, plays could be performed for the entertainment of the people. They also loved sports. In fact, we get our Olympics to this day from the Greeks. This is a hippodrome for the racing of horses and chariots, and of course gambling went on in these types of events, but the Greeks loved sports. Alexander the Great set out to conquer the Persian Empire, and he began his campaign in Asia Minor and started working his way east, and won a huge battle at Issus, a very decisive battle against the Persians, and then he began to work his way south along the coast where Israel is located, and then down to Egypt, back up, and worked his way east all the way to India. His troops were tired by that point, and they really didn't want to go any farther, so they pretty much refused to continue fighting. So Alexander and his troops began the long march back to the homeland. And Alexander got as far as the city of Babylon. He became sick there and died of some unknown disease. Possibly it was malaria. As impressive as his military conquests were, Alexander's contribution, or major contribution, was the unification of Western and Eastern cultures. For the first time in history, brought these two very diverse cultures together. And this union of East and West lasted for about 1,000 years. Even though his political kingdom didn't last that long, quickly split up among his 4 generals, but culturally his empire and influence lasted until the rise of Islam many, many years later. Early on, the relationship between the Greeks and the Jews was pretty good. The Jews were looking for relief from the oppression of the Persians, and they actually welcomed the Greeks at first. There's a legend or story that Jaddua, the high priest, when Alexander came into the land, he showed him the book of Daniel and how Daniel had predicted that Greece would be the conquering empire over Persia. And so Alexander, the story goes, was happy with that prophecy and gave certain privileges to the Jews. And so, although maybe some of the facts of that story are doubted, it shows that early on the relationship between the Jews and the Greeks were pretty favorable. Alexander, as we said, died suddenly at the age of 32 in Babylon, and he hadn't picked a successor. He did have a son, but he didn't appoint his son as his successor. And so over a period of years, his generals fought over the empire and later divided it up into 4 partitions, with Cassander over in Macedonia, Lysimachus in Anatolia, northern Anatolia, Ptolemy down in Egypt, and Seleucus in Syria and to the east. And so there were many battles between these 4 portions of the Greek Empire, and a lot of chaos ensued after Alexander's death. Many conflicts, especially between the 2 groups that are important for biblical history, and that is the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Ptolemies being down in Egypt. The way I remember that, Egypt has a PT, and there's a PT on the beginning of Ptolemies. And the Seleucids were based in Antioch of Syria, and many of their rulers went by the name of Antiochus, which makes it a little bit easier to remember. So either the ruler was Antiochus or Seleucus the first, second, third. So their base or their main center was Antioch in Syria. And so Israel early on was under the Ptolemies, but a little bit later on will come under the reign of the Seleucids. And these 2 divisions of the former Greek Empire, the unified empire, battled each other for years and years, many battles between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And they finally got tired of all the battles, and they decided, well, let's make peace. And the way they decided to do that was King Ptolemy II offered his daughter Bernice to King Antiochus II in kind of a marriage alliance that they hope would bring peace and bring these two warring parties together. But there were a lot of problems with that. First of all, being the fact that Antiochus was already married. He was already married to a lady by the name of Laodice. And as much as they tried to make things right, this whole marriage peace plan was a disaster. And it fell apart and resulted in people getting killed, and the animosity continued between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And this is very accurately detailed in Daniel chapter 11. Well, we see the Ptolemies ruled Israel from 323 down to 198, and then from 198 to 164, the Seleucids were the ones in power. So life under the Ptolemies was bearable, but and early on under the Seleucids, again, it was bearable, but then things started to turn sour. Well, this is King Ptolemy I, and you can see he adopted to the ways of the Egyptians, even though he was Greek. You can see here he looks very Egyptian, so he was into contextualization. And so he was depicted as an Egyptian, and he was the first ruler, Greek ruler in Egypt for the Ptolemaic period. And he established the city of Alexandria there to rival Athens, and they built a very impressive library there, one of the most impressive libraries in the world. They had one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Pharos Tower, Lighthouse Tower, which had a huge flame at the top that would warn ships to stay away from the coastline lest they come across the jagged coast there and get shipwrecked. So many Jews moved to Egypt during this time period. Okay, there was tolerance by the Ptolemies for the Jews, and so Alexandria was a place of learning and education and the great library. So a lot of the Jews, especially the intellectuals, moved to Egypt, in particular the city of Alexandria during this time. And over time, they picked up Greek, but they began to lose their Hebrew. And that's what happens if you don't use a language, you lose it. And so there became a need to translate the Old Testament scriptures from Hebrew into Greek. We call that translation the Septuagint. And that happened at this time period. Okay, so we're going to look now at the rivalry between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And Antiochus III was the ruler when power in Israel was turned over to the Seleucids. So at a very important battle at Panias, about 198 BC, the Seleucids defeated the Ptolemies. So they gained control over the area of Israel. So Israel came under the Seleucids about 198 BC. In the background, though, another empire is rising up, and that's the Empire of Rome. Now you can see in the top part of this map, Rome is outlined with a blue circle. It's quite small. It pretty much just covers the area of Italy. You can see the Ptolemaic kingdom, the fact that it includes Israel, and then the Seleucid kingdom to the north and to the east. But if you look at the lower map, you'll see between 270 BC of the upper map and 192 BC of the lower map, that Rome is increased in size and power tremendously. And you'll also see that the Ptolemaic kingdom no longer includes Israel. Okay, that's because they fell, that area fell to the Seleucids in 198. So the Seleucids are now controlling, but Rome is on the rise, and Rome is in the background, and the Greeks are fearing an all-out war with Rome. They're trying to avoid that at all costs. And there was a very decisive battle at Magnesia in 190, and then the Greeks, Seleucids, established a peace treaty in 188 BC at a place called Apamea. And so this was a real turning point. The Roman Empire was really coming up, and the former Greek Empire, that is the Seleucids, were descending in power.